It began, as so many stories of the 20th century did, with an idea that seemed too small to matter. A drink, a bottle, and a promise that wherever an American went, Coca-Cola would be there. In the 1930s, that promise was only marketing poetry, a slogan meant to sell a sweet, fizzy taste of home. But when the world fell into war, it became something far stranger, an unofficial mission that would follow soldiers into deserts, jungles, and ruins, carrying with it not just sugar and carbonation, but an entire vision of America itself. Coca-Cola had always believed in presence. By 1939, it was already the most recognized brand in the United States, sold in every city and town, poured at baseball games, drive-ins, and family picnics. Its curved bottle was more than packaging. It was identity. But outside America, the drink was still a novelty, a curiosity of the Jazz Age. Europe had its own tastes, its own factories, and the looming shadow of war made expansion seem impossible. Then, almost overnight, that impossibility became necessity. When Hitler's armies rolled across Europe, trade routes snapped shut. American companies either pulled out or watched their assets seized. Coca-Cola's German subsidiary, Coca-Cola GmbH, found itself cut off from Atlanta. The head of the German branch, Max Keith, was a company loyalist but also a pragmatist. He kept the business alive by inventing a wartime substitute made from leftover fruit pulp and whey. He called it Fanta. It would later become one of Coca-Cola's most profitable products. But in those years, it was a sign of survival. The brand could adapt to any empire. Across the Atlantic, the executives in Atlanta watched Europe burn and wondered what would happen to their empire of bottles and slogans. The company's president, Robert Woodruff, was no politician, but he understood one truth about power. Nations rise, but habits stay. And Coca-Cola had become a habit, the American habit. When the United States entered the war in 1941, Woodruff saw not disaster, but opportunity. If the American soldier could be made to associate the taste of Coke with the taste of home, the brand would survive anything. Wherever our boys go, he declared, they'll have Coca-Cola. It sounded like patriotism, but it was also strategy. He wasn't selling a drink to civilians anymore. He was binding his company to the greatest military machine on earth. Within months, Coca-Cola's bottling plants began to retool under government contracts. They didn't produce ammunition or tanks. They produced morale. The company promised to sell Coke to the army at cost, earning no profit, on one condition: that it be allowed to follow the troops. The U.S. War Department agreed. It seemed harmless enough, a soft drink for soldiers. No one realized it was the beginning of one of the largest corporate logistics operations of the war. In 1942, as the first American divisions shipped out for North Africa, Coca-Cola shipped out with them. The Army called it a special service. The men called it happiness in a bottle. Portable bottling units, entire factories packed into crates, were loaded onto ships and sent to ports in Oran, Algiers, and Casablanca. Engineers in khaki uniforms, wearing small coat patches on their sleeves, followed the troops. They weren't enlisted soldiers, but they carried military passes, answered to the Quartermaster Corps, and lived under the same conditions as the men they served. Officially, they were technical observers. Unofficially, they were missionaries of American culture. Each bottling unit could turn out tens of thousands of bottles a day, using whatever water was available, filtered, chlorinated, and carbonated on site. Syrup arrived in sealed drums marked War Department Supply. The first time a platoon in North Africa found an ice-cold Coke waiting for them in the desert heat. Letters home multiplied by the thousands. They brought us Coca-Cola, 1 GI wrote, and for a minute, it felt like Main Street again. Commanders noticed the morale boost. So did the brass. What started as an experiment became doctrine. By 1943, Woodruff's quiet operation had become an empire within an empire. The company built or supervised 64 bottling plants across every theater of war, from New Guinea to Normandy. Each was staffed by civilians in uniform-like attire, paid by Coca-Cola, but protected by the U.S. Army. They traveled in convoys, endured bombings, and sometimes died alongside soldiers. To the men in the field, they were simply the Coke men. To the company back home, they were the future. There was nothing overtly secret about what they were doing, yet the scale, the coordination, and the access they enjoyed were unprecedented. In war zones where even journalists were restricted, Coca-Cola had free movement. Its technicians could visit airfields, supply depots, and frontline camps under the banner of morale service. They mapped roads, tested water sources, recorded local conditions. Without meaning to, they became one of the most well-traveled information networks of the war. Decades later, historians would half-jokingly call them the soda spies. They weren't gathering intelligence, at least not intentionally, but they were everywhere the army went, and sometimes places it wasn't supposed to be. The German propaganda ministry noticed. In 1943, Der Angriff ran a piece accusing Coca-Cola of being a weapon of Yankee imperialism. The article sneered that the Allies didn't fight with courage, but with commerce, flooding Europe with chewing gum, nylon, and Coca-Cola. They weren't entirely wrong. In every liberated town, before the flags and speeches, came the trucks, and on those trucks, pallets of bottles stamped with the red and white script that symbolized everything Germany had tried to destroy. To millions of Europeans, that first sip of Coke wasn't just sugar and caffeine. It was the taste of the new world arriving. For American generals, that symbolism had strategic value. Armies conquer, but cultures occupy. The Army's psychological warfare division understood that. They encouraged the distribution of familiar consumer goods in liberated areas as proof of abundance. A warm coat might mean survival, but a cold Coke meant normal life. In Italy, French Morocco, Belgium, and eventually Germany itself, the drink became a calling card of liberation. Civilians lined up with the soldiers. Local entrepreneurs begged for franchise rights. By the end of the war, Coca-Cola wasn't just following the U.S. Army. It was planting flags of its own. Behind the scenes, Robert Woodruff kept meticulous control. He met regularly with military officials, often behind closed doors. He spoke little about profit. His language was patriotic. The Coca-Cola Company exists to serve the country, he told the War Production Board, in peace and war. Yet every plant built under those contracts would remain a Coca-Cola asset after the fighting stopped. When peace returned, the bottling lines already straddled the globe, from Calcutta to Cairo, from London to Manila. What had been a morale project became a permanent infrastructure of global distribution. The soft drink had marched with the armies and stayed behind to rule the peace. No other corporation managed anything similar. Pepsi tried, belatedly, to attach itself to naval canteens, but never caught the same wave. By 1945, Coca-Cola was not only the most recognizable brand on Earth. It was, for many outside America, their first tangible encounter with the idea of America itself. Soldiers could carry flags and rifles. Coke carried comfort, sweetness, and the illusion of endless supply. That was the secret mission, never officially written, never declared, to make the world safe not just for democracy, but for the marketplace. It wasn't espionage or propaganda in the traditional sense. It was something subtler, more durable. When the war ended, the Coca-Cola plants remained, and so did the taste. In towns shattered by bombing, the first new factories to open bore the red sign. In the black market stalls of Berlin and the cafes of Rome, Coke became currency. And while the diplomats carved up Europe, Coca-Cola did something no government could. It gave people something to smile about. That smile, captured in photographs of GIs handing bottles to children, became one of the most powerful images of the post-war age. When the Allied invasion of France began on June 6, 1944, it wasn't only men and machines that crossed the channel. Hidden among the mountains of crates and fuel drums were wooden boxes stamped with a small red emblem, the curved script of Coca-Cola. The company had been preparing for this moment for almost 2 years. Every truck route, every supply depot, every advance base had a parallel plan drawn up by Coca-Cola's War Department liaison office. Wherever the Army went, the bottlers would follow within days. They called it the 80-mile rule. No soldier should ever be more than 80 miles from an ice-cold Coke. It sounded absurd. The beaches of Normandy were a killing ground. Europe was rubble and chaos. But for the Coca-Cola Company, that chaos was an opening. The U.S. Quartermaster Corps needed morale supplies that didn't interfere with ammunition and rations. Coke provided both efficiency and symbolism. Its engineers, called technical observers, but known to the troops as Coca-Cola Commandos, landed with the second and third waves of support units. They carried not rifles, but blueprints and filters. Within weeks, the first portable bottling plant was operating near Cherbourg, powered by generators and shielded by sandbags. The French civilians who watched the operation couldn't quite believe it. The Americans built a factory in the middle of a battlefield, not to make weapons, but to make a drink. The line workers wore khaki like everyone else, but their badges carried the Coke logo. Trucks rolled out loaded with wooden crates, each bottle capped with the same red crown seal you could find in Georgia or Illinois. For the GIs slogging through the hedgerows, that taste was a miracle, familiar, sweet, a reminder of home so strong it almost hurt. It was the first thing that didn't taste like war, one veteran said years later. The company documented everything. Photographers and writers, many of them hired through the Army's own information units, sent back reports that blurred the line between advertising and history. Pictures of smiling soldiers with Coke bottles appeared in Stars and Stripes and Life magazine, always with the same message: wherever there are Americans, there is Coca-Cola. It became not just a slogan, but a policy of morale management. Even General Eisenhower, a man not prone to sentimentality, approved the effort. He wrote to the company's headquarters in Atlanta thanking them for their invaluable contribution to the comfort and efficiency of our forces. Behind the smiles, it was a feat of logistics almost as complex as the invasion itself. A single bottling plant could produce up to 40,000 bottles a day. The syrup concentrate arrived from the U.S. in 55-gallon drums marked War Priority Beverage Supply. Sugar and glass were ration commodities, so Coca-Cola coordinated with the War Production Board to ensure a steady flow without disrupting critical resources. Local water was filtered and tested for safety. Engineers built cooling systems out of scrap metal and converted captured German refrigerators into field coolers. Every crate, bottle, and cap was inventoried with military precision. By August, as the Allies broke out of Normandy and raced toward Paris, Coke's mobile bottling units followed in convoy columns. They moved through towns still scarred by bombing, setting up shop in warehouses and schoolhouses. In liberated villages, children would gather to watch the Americans unload their machines, the hiss of carbonation sounding like magic. A French newspaper marveled that no sooner does the Yankee arrive than he builds a temple to his drink. It wasn't wrong. The red sign went up almost as soon as the flags did. When Paris was liberated in late August, Coca-Cola's representatives were already there. Within days, the first public shipments were distributed to French troops and civilians. For many Parisians, it was their first taste. The reactions were mixed. Some found it strange, others thrilling, but all understood its meaning. The drink symbolized abundance, freedom, and American modernity. French journalists joked that Coca-Cola was the Fifth Allied Army. Even Charles de Gaulle, who disdained American cultural influence, had to admit privately that the public relations value was enormous. They give the people joy, he said grudgingly. In Belgium and the Netherlands, the story was the same. Each time the front moved, new bottling units sprang up behind it. By December 1944, 23 plants were operating across liberated Europe, producing millions of bottles a week. Coca-Cola even developed a system for distributing the empties. Special trucks collected used bottles, sanitized them in mobile washers, and sent them back down the line. Nothing was wasted. Every bottle reused was one less to ship across the Atlantic. The efficiency impressed even the Army's logistics officers. One colonel called it the best supply chain outside the Ordnance Corps. The war was still far from over. The German counteroffensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, caught everyone by surprise, including the Coke men. Several bottling depots were overrun or destroyed. At Bastogne, during the siege, soldiers later recalled finding shattered bottles frozen in the snow. Yet within days of the breakthrough, Coca-Cola trucks were back on the roads. The brand had become so tied to morale that generals treated it like ammunition. A division without Coke was considered undersupplied. The company's field managers sometimes worked under artillery fire, repairing machinery and restoring flow. They wore no rank insignia, but among the troops they earned one, the bottlers of the Bulge. When the Allies crossed the Rhine in 1945, Coca-Cola crossed with them. In Cologne, engineers set up the first bottling operation on German soil before the shooting had even stopped. For civilians emerging from basements, the sight of American soldiers handing out bottles of a foreign drink was surreal. The flavor was unlike anything they had known. Sweet, bright, impossible to describe. Children traded the empty bottles as trophies. Black marketeers hoarded the full ones for cigarettes or food. In that ruined land, Coca-Cola became a currency of its own. For the company, this was the culmination of Robert Woodruff's wartime vision. He had promised to follow the army to the ends of the earth, and he had done it. From a single agreement with the War Department had come a network of factories, technicians, and supply lines that spanned half the world. Each of those wartime bottling plants would, in peacetime, become a permanent foothold. The men who had run them, trained engineers, many veterans themselves, would stay to manage new civilian franchises. Within a year of victory, Europe was dotted with Coke plants. Antwerp, Brussels, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna. The drink that had once been a comfort for soldiers now flowed through the markets of a recovering continent. But what no one outside the company quite understood was that the operation had done more than sell a product. It had built a network of influence. The Coca-Cola men had personal contacts with U.S. generals, local mayors, railway directors, and civilian contractors. They knew how to navigate occupation bureaucracy and post-war rationing systems. When other American companies tried to expand overseas after 1945, they often found that Coca-Cola had already paved the way, literally and diplomatically. The pipelines that once carried syrup for soldiers now carried the raw material of a global business empire. The irony was that none of it had been in the original plan. The company had simply wanted to be near the troops. Yet in doing so, it had become a symbol of American permanence. A bottle of Coke in 1945 was a promise that the abundance of wartime America, the trucks, the songs, the cigarettes, the laughter, would not disappear when the soldiers went home. It was the taste of victory, and it stayed behind. In Germany, Coca-Cola's role took on another dimension. The company reclaimed its pre-war bottling plants, including the facilities in Essen and Hamburg that had once produced Fanta under Max Keith. Instead of punishing him for running the business under Nazi rule, Woodruff's team quietly rehired him. He had kept the brand alive through the war, after all, and his connections in the German market were invaluable. The result was a strange continuity. The same man who had made soft drinks for Hitler's Germany now helped reintroduce Coke to occupied Europe. It was business stripped of ideology, and it worked. Within 3 years, Germany was one of Coca-Cola's biggest markets outside the United States. For the soldiers who had fought their way across Europe, that transformation was hard to grasp. They remembered the drink as a ration, a symbol of camaraderie. When they came home and found it in every store, it felt less like advertising and more like reunion. The war had turned Coca-Cola into something larger than a product. It had made it a piece of collective memory. To open a bottle was to remember a moment, a beach, a muddy road, a letter from home. That emotional bond would outlast the uniforms. By 1946, Coca-Cola's European operations employed more people than its entire pre-war global staff. The company sent managers back to the same places they had once served as technical observers, now with civilian suits instead of khaki. The old army trucks were repainted in red. The company even produced a training film for new employees titled "The Bottle Follows the Flag." It wasn't distributed publicly, but within the corporation it became legend, a reminder that their global empire had been born on the battlefields of Europe. What had begun as a patriotic gesture had turned into the quiet conquest of a continent. No diplomat could have planned it better. While the Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe's infrastructure, Coca-Cola rebuilt its spirit, one bottle at a time. By early 1945, as Allied armies advanced into Germany, Coca-Cola's infrastructure had become a shadow supply chain moving just behind the front. The company's technical observers had traveled thousands of miles across Europe in 2 years, establishing bottling units in nearly every major logistics hub under American control. They worked with the same discipline as any combat engineer unit. Survey the site, test the water, set up filtration and carbonation, unpack the generators, and begin bottling. The efficiency bordered on the military because, in effect, it was one. The end of fighting did not mean the end of the mission. The moment German resistance collapsed, Coca-Cola's managers received new orders from Atlanta and from the Army's Civil Affairs Division. Move in with the occupation forces. The first target cities were Frankfurt, Munich, Hamburg, and Vienna. In each of them, the company had pre-war assets that had survived the bombing, often stripped, damaged, or looted, but structurally intact. Reclaiming them required both speed and diplomacy. Germany in May 1945 was a vacuum. Allied military government officers controlled all business activity. Nothing could open without their approval. But Coca-Cola had an advantage. It already operated under U.S. quartermaster protection. Its engineers were registered as civilian personnel, supporting the Army's welfare services. They could move supplies through military transport channels, draw fuel from Allied depots, and bypass the tangled bureaucracy that strangled most civilian enterprises. In practice, this made Coca-Cola one of the first functioning American businesses in occupied Europe. In Frankfurt, the company's old plant on Hainer Weg had been bombed repeatedly, but not destroyed. Within weeks of the city's capture, a small American team arrived with equipment and spare parts shipped from England. They worked alongside German technicians who had once produced Fanta under Max Keith's direction. The collaboration was pragmatic, almost surreal. Former enemies rebuilding a factory that had served both sides of the war. But for the Allied authorities, it was precisely the kind of reconstruction they wanted to encourage. Factories meant employment. Employment meant stability. The military government granted Coca-Cola priority access to utilities and raw materials on the grounds of public morale. In Munich, the story was similar. The plant there, confiscated by the Nazi regime in 1942, had survived the war in relatively good condition. U.S. Army engineers cleared the rubble from the yard and provided generators. Within months, bottling resumed, first for Allied troops, then for German civilians. The first batch of post-war German Coca-Cola rolled off the line in October 1945, less than 6 months after Germany's surrender. It was distributed to American occupation forces and to selected local shops authorized by the military command. For many Germans, it was the first taste of a peacetime commodity, the first sign that something resembling normal life might return. Coca-Cola's leadership in Atlanta watched these developments with a mixture of pride and caution. They knew the brand had become politically charged. To many Europeans, the drink represented American abundance. To others, it symbolized cultural domination. The company took care to frame its return not as commercial conquest, but as humanitarian service. Official statements emphasized employment, reconstruction, and friendship. Coca-Cola, one press release declared in 1946, comes not as a conqueror, but as a neighbor. It was an echo of General Eisenhower's own rhetoric about democratic occupation. In occupied Austria, the situation was more complex. Vienna was divided among the 4 Allied powers, and every economic decision required quadripartite approval. Yet Coca-Cola managed to open a bottling plant on the American-controlled outskirts of the city by early 1946. The facility was technically a joint military welfare project, its production allocated partly to the U.S. forces and partly to the local civilian market. The Russians viewed it with suspicion, calling it a capitalist morale operation. But the Red Army soon tolerated it. Their own soldiers bought the drink from black market traders who operated across the sector borders. Coca-Cola had done what no diplomat could. It crossed the first borders of the Cold War with a bottle. By the end of 1946, the company's European division had been reorganized entirely around the new geography of power. Headquarters moved from London to Brussels, chosen for its central location and stable government. From there, regional offices oversaw operations in France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, and Austria. Each plant that had been built under wartime contracts was converted into a civilian franchise, licensed to local management, but supplied through Coca-Cola's American production network. The machinery, the recipes, and even the bottling lines were the same as those used for the U.S. Army. The war's logistics became peacetime commerce. Economically, the timing was perfect. Europe was starved for goods but rich in goodwill toward the United States. Every truck, painted with a white star or a red Coca-Cola logo, carried symbolic weight. When the Marshall Plan began in 1948, its shipments of American grain, steel, and machinery were accompanied by the familiar drink. Officially, Coca-Cola was not part of the plan, but its presence dovetailed perfectly with its aims. American policymakers viewed the spread of consumer goods as part of political stabilization. In memos between the State Department and the company's Washington representatives, the phrase recurred again and again: material well-being breeds democratic loyalty. In that sense, Coca-Cola's post-war expansion was more than a business success. It was a quiet instrument of American diplomacy. The U.S. government never subsidized the company directly, but it facilitated its operations through logistics and trade privileges. Army trucks delivered syrup drums to plants still operating under military supervision. Embassies hosted receptions where foreign officials were photographed holding the drink. Every bottle, every advertisement carried an implicit message. American life, even at its most ordinary, was better than anything totalitarianism could offer. For Germans and Austrians living amid ruins, that message resonated. A bottle of Coke was cheap, cheerful, and, most importantly, American. It stood for a culture of abundance that felt almost miraculous after years of ration cards. Bars and cafes that managed a secure supply lines displayed the red sign proudly, sometimes alongside the Allied flags. It was a small act of alignment in a divided world. To drink Coke was to look west. Max Keith, the man who had kept the German branch alive through the Nazi years, became central to this transformation. He was reinstated as head of Coca-Cola GmbH under Allied supervision. His wartime record was examined, but cleared. He had maintained the company without Nazi Party membership and had even refused to replace the American parent company's trademarks. Under his leadership, the German market recovered astonishingly fast. By 1948, production had exceeded pre-war levels. Fanta, the wartime substitute, was reintroduced as a companion brand rather than a rival. The irony of its origins only added to its appeal. In Austria, similar patterns emerged. The Vienna plant expanded rapidly, serving not only the American sector, but the British and French ones as well. In 1949, when the Allied Council began lifting economic restrictions, Coca-Cola was among the first Western products to be officially sold in all four sectors of the city, including the Soviet one. Even the Russian authorities, wary of propaganda but eager for foreign currency, allowed limited sales. For ordinary Viennese, a bottle of Coke was a small luxury that transcended ideology. In cafes and cinemas, it appeared beside newsreels of the Berlin airlift and the first stirrings of Cold War tension, a silent, fizzy reminder that life was resuming. For the company's executives, the European recovery validated Robert Woodruff's wartime gamble. By 1950, Coca-Cola's overseas sales accounted for a quarter of its revenue, compared to barely 10% before the war. Every bottling plant built under U.S. Army auspices had turned into a profitable franchise. The Coca-Cola Commandos, who had once worn khaki uniforms, now ran regional offices as civilian managers. They spoke the languages, knew the roads, and maintained friendships with local officials. In many ways, they were America's first unofficial ambassadors of the consumer age. Through it all, the company maintained the tone of benevolence that had characterized its wartime communications. Its internal documents spoke not of markets, but of service and fellowship. Advertisements showed soldiers turned tourists, smiling with local children, sharing the drink that had bridged the war. In the shattered capitals of Europe, those images carried the optimism of a world trying to forget its darkness. In the first years after victory, Europe remained a continent suspended between hunger and hope. Cities were rebuilding, borders redrawn, and the emerging fault line between East and West ran not only through governments, but through every factory, railway, and port. Into this uneasy landscape moved the same quiet civilian army that had followed the U.S. soldiers to war, the men and women of the Coca-Cola Company. Between 1947 and 1949, the Marshall Plan reshaped Europe's recovery. Its billions of dollars in aid built bridges, railways, and power stations. Its subtext built allegiance. American policymakers believed prosperity was the best defense against communism, and consumer goods were its most visible expression. Coca-Cola fitted that philosophy perfectly. It required little raw material, used existing transport networks, and produced a product instantly recognizable as American. The State Department never issued direct instructions, but there was a shared understanding. Wherever the Marshall Plan went, Coke would follow. By mid-1947, the company had reopened or established plants in France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Switzerland, Italy, Germany, and Austria. Distribution maps from corporate archives mirror the political map of the Western Alliance almost exactly. Each franchise functioned independently, but reported through Brussels to Atlanta, forming what internal memoranda call the European Zone. The zone operated under three principles: local ownership, standardized quality, and American identity. Every bottle carried the same trademark, the same recipe, and the same message of abundance. Germany remained the center of operations. Frankfurt became the hub for syrup distribution. Hamburg handled glass and machinery imports. The company rebuilt its German supply chain using ex-military transport routes that paralleled the U.S. Army zone. Trains loaded with empty bottles ran on the same schedules as food convoys, often under Allied escort to prevent theft and black market diversion. In 1948, as currency reform stabilized the West German economy, Coca-Cola's sales soared. By the end of that year, it employed more than 4,000 Germans and produced 2 million bottles a day. For many workers, it was their first steady post-war job. Then came the Berlin crisis. In June 1948, Soviet authorities cut off all road and rail access to West Berlin, hoping to force the Allies out of the city. The response, the Berlin airlift, became one of the defining events of the Cold War's opening act. For nearly a year, Allied aircraft supplied the city entirely by air, delivering food, coal, and medicine. Coca-Cola was not an official participant, but its infrastructure became part of the logistical ecosystem that sustained the effort. At Tempelhof Airfield, the U.S. Army built vast supply dumps for incoming freight. Among the warehouses requisitioned for support services were several previously used by the company. Coca-Cola's trucks, drivers, and maintenance teams, already licensed under the U.S. Occupation Authority, assisted in transporting non-priority cargo and equipment within the western sectors. The company also provided bottled drinks to canteens serving airlift crews and ground staff, paid for by the Army, but bottled locally in West Germany. The gesture, small compared to the tonnage of coal or flour, carried immense symbolic value. Berliners watching American planes land associated the familiar logo on crates with relief and survival. The U.S. Information Service noted in a 1949 report that consumer goods of recognized American origin had become unofficial emblems of reassurance. No single brand was mentioned, but everyone knew which one they meant. When the blockade ended in May 1949, Coca-Cola moved quickly to consolidate its position. It reactivated its pre-war plant in West Berlin's Tempelhof district within months. The Soviet authorities objected, but could not prevent it. The plant lay just inside the American sector. Production began in early 1950 under heavy guard, using water drawn from deep wells to ensure purity. Distribution was confined to the western sectors, but the company's trucks soon became a familiar sight at Allied festivals and political rallies, their presence quietly reinforcing the message that the West could deliver both security and comfort. While Berlin symbolized the confrontation, the rest of Western Europe symbolized recovery. In France, new bottling plants appeared in Lyon, Marseille, and Bordeaux. Italy's first post-war franchise opened in Naples in 1947 and rapidly expanded northward, helped by the U.S. military's continued presence. In Belgium and the Netherlands, Coca-Cola became one of the earliest American firms to pay wages in local currency rather than U.S. dollars, a sign of confidence in economic stabilization. Everywhere the pattern repeated. The company employed local workers, bought local sugar and glass, but imported the syrup from America. The product was simultaneously international and unmistakably American. Behind this growth lay careful coordination with U.S. foreign policy goals. American officials in Europe understood that brands carried ideological weight. Internal State Department correspondents refer to certain firms as ambassadors of daily life. Coca-Cola executives were invited to briefings alongside representatives from news agencies, film distributors, and relief organizations. They were asked not to advertise aggressively in sensitive regions. Occupied Germany, for instance, but to maintain visibility through service and sponsorship. The idea was to make American abundance appear natural, inevitable, and benevolent. Coke fit the script better than any pamphlet could. The expansion eastward, however, stopped at the Iron Curtain. In Czechoslovakia, where the company had reopened a pre-war franchise in 1947, nationalization under the communist government ended operations within a year. In Hungary and Poland, similar attempts were blocked by authorities who denounced the drink as capitalist poison. Soviet newspapers portrayed it as a symbol of Western decadence, equating it with jazz, blue jeans, and Hollywood. For the Western Allies, that hostility only reinforced its propaganda value. What the East rejected, the West embraced. By 1950, the statistics told the story. Coca-Cola operated 82 bottling plants in Europe, producing nearly 300 million bottles a year. Its European headquarters in Brussels employed staff from a dozen countries. Every major U.S. base from Iceland to Trieste stocked the drink. Every major Western capital hosted at least one franchise. The wartime bottle that followed the flag had become a network that mirrored the emerging Western alliance itself. In practice, it was NATO's civilian supply chain. Wherever an American soldier or diplomat was stationed, Coca-Cola's trucks were rarely far behind. The company's executives understood that this success carried political implications. In internal meetings, they debated how to avoid appearing as an instrument of U.S. foreign policy while benefiting from its protection. The solution was to emphasize local partnership. Franchises were presented as independent European enterprises, even when Atlanta retained majority control. Advertising avoided overt nationalism and focused on universal themes: friendship, refreshment, youth. The underlying message remained unmistakable. The modern world was American in flavor. By the time the Korean War broke out in 1950, Coca-Cola's secret mission had effectively ended. It no longer needed the U.S. Army's patronage. The logistics, factories, and goodwill built during World War II and its aftermath had given the company a permanent seat in Europe's post-war economy. What began as a wartime morale operation had evolved into the first truly global consumer network, a network that would define American cultural power for the rest of the century. By the early 1950s, the war that had built Coca-Cola's European empire was over, but the world it created was only beginning. The physical infrastructure the company had laid down, bottling plants, distribution depots, supply contacts, and transport routes, was still operating almost exactly as it had during the war. The U.S. military had withdrawn from many of its temporary bases, yet the roads, warehouses, and rail links they left behind formed the skeleton of a new commercial order. Coca-Cola was one of the first private firms to use it at full scale. Between 1950 and 1955, the company doubled its European production. Plants that had served the U.S. occupation forces in Germany and Austria were now fully privatized and reintegrated into the Western economy. In West Berlin, the Tempelhof plant expanded to supply the entire city. In Frankfurt, Coca-Cola's headquarters oversaw a franchise network that reached into the Rhineland and Bavaria. Each franchise employed local workers, but reported quarterly to Brussels, which in turn coordinated with Atlanta. The system mirrored the emerging structure of Western alliances, national autonomy bound together by American coordination. American diplomats noticed. Embassies often used Coca-Cola's distribution chain to move supplies or communications through friendly countries. In return, the company received preferential customs treatment and military transport assistance. None of it was secret in the espionage sense. It was simply convenient. Yet the effect was unmistakable. A private corporation's logistics network was reinforcing U.S. soft power on a continental scale. At the same time, Coca-Cola was becoming part of domestic politics across Europe. In Italy and France, communist parties accused it of being a Trojan horse for capitalism. Labor unions organized protests outside bottling plants, calling the drink liquid imperialism. In Turin in 1951, militants threw stones at Coke trucks during a May Day march. In Marseilles, pamphlets claimed the beverage contained narcotics designed to Americanize the youth. These accusations were absurd, but they revealed how deeply the brand had penetrated the public imagination. The U.S. State Department quietly monitored such incidents, regarding them as a barometer of anti-American sentiment. The drink had become an ideological symbol. In Western Europe, that symbolism generally worked in Coca-Cola's favor. To the new middle class created by Marshall Plan recovery, the bottle represented more than refreshment. It stood for modern life, refrigerators, radios, and automobiles. In advertisements, the company avoided overt politics, but showed scenes of leisure and prosperity that aligned perfectly with Western consumer ideals. By 1955, its European market share rivaled that of the United States itself. What had begun as a wartime morale product was now one of the pillars of post-war identity. Coca-Cola's expansion soon extended beyond Europe. The same wartime engineers who had built portable bottling plants for the Army now designed facilities for Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. They used the same blueprints, the same filtration systems, and sometimes even the same Army surplus equipment. Military precision became corporate standard. The logistical experience gained under the U.S. War Department turned out to be the company's most valuable post-war asset. During the 1950s, as the Cold War hardened, Washington began to recognize the political utility of global consumer brands. The United States Information Agency, formed in 1953, included Coca-Cola in its cultural exhibits abroad. The company sponsored American pavilions at trade fairs in Europe and Asia, presenting itself as a benign emblem of everyday freedom. A single bottle, simple and familiar, could do more to humanize America than any speech or treaty. This was soft power at its most subtle, and it drew directly on the habits formed during World War II. Within the company, executives still refer to the wartime years as the service period. Corporate histories written in the 1950s described it in near-military language: theaters of operation, lines of supply, forward bases. They emphasized the sacrifice of the Coca-Cola men who had worked in combat zones. In 1956, the company dedicated a memorial plaque at its Atlanta headquarters listing 49 employees who had died while serving with military units during the war. The plaque framed their work as patriotic duty, not commerce, a narrative that cemented the moral legitimacy of Coca-Cola's global role. By the 1960s, historians and journalists began to notice that Coca-Cola's wartime expansion had been far more systematic than anyone had realized. Former Army logistics officers spoke of the Coke Plan as an unofficial morale doctrine. Archival research later confirmed that the U.S. War Department had approved more than 60 bottling facilities under special priority codes, giving them access to materials denied to most civilian industries. The company's own records, opened decades later, revealed just how deeply intertwined its operations had been with the Allied war machine. Every front, North Africa, Italy, Normandy, the Pacific, had its own parallel Coca-Cola command structure, complete with technical officers, maintenance crews, and security clearances. For business historians, this was a revelation. The modern multinational corporation had been shaped not by peacetime trade, but by wartime logistics. The techniques that allowed Coca-Cola to deliver a bottle to a foxhole in 1944 were the same that allowed it to supply supermarkets worldwide in 1964. War had industrialized efficiency. Peace had commercialized it. Politically, the company continued to navigate between commerce and diplomacy. In 1959, when U.S. Vice President Richard Nixon met Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev at the American National Exhibition in Moscow, the famous kitchen debate, the refreshment table, included Coca-Cola. Soviet officials refused to drink it publicly, but behind the scenes they sampled it out of curiosity. The company later used that anecdote in internal publicity. Even behind the Iron Curtain, the taste was irresistible. Within a decade, Coca-Cola would indeed enter Eastern markets under tightly controlled trade agreements, closing the circle begun during the war. Back in Europe, the company maintained its alignment with American policy almost instinctively. When NATO established its permanent headquarters in Paris in 1952, Coca-Cola provided catering and vending services for Allied staff. When NATO moved to Brussels in 1967, the company relocated its European office there as well, symbolically anchoring itself to the Western Alliance. The red and white logo became as common on the highways of Western Europe as the blue flags of the new European community. In the eyes of both admirers and critics, the two symbols were inseparable. Scholarly reassessment in the 1970s and 1980s added nuance. Economic historians pointed out that Coca-Cola's secret mission had not been a conspiracy, but an early example of what would later be called public-private partnership. The U.S. government needed morale and symbolism. The company provided both at cost, gaining global infrastructure in return. Cultural historians, meanwhile, traced how wartime exposure had normalized the idea of American products as universal standards. The bottle that followed the flag had also carried a set of values: efficiency, optimism, and mass reproducibility that defined the modern West. By the end of the 20th century, the scale of that transformation was evident. In 1939, Coca-Cola had operated in 44 countries. By 1945, despite war, the number had risen to 64. By 1960, it was over 100. Nearly every new market could be traced back to a wartime or post-war bottling plant originally built for the U.S. Armed Forces. The secret mission had outlived the war itself. It had become the company's DNA. When researchers in the 1990s examined declassified Allied logistics files, they found that Coca-Cola had moved more tonnage through military shipping channels than any other non-essential commodity during the Second World War. Enough syrup and equipment to produce over 5 billion bottles. What began as a morale gesture had turned into a supply operation rivaling that of entire nations. That realization reframed the story. The secret mission of Coca-Cola in World War II was not espionage, propaganda, or profiteering. It was the birth of globalization as a logistical reality. The company's wartime pledge to deliver a taste of home to every American soldier became, in practice, the blueprint for delivering a piece of America to the entire world. By the last decades of the 20th century, the world Coca-Cola had helped shape was almost unrecognizable from the one it had entered in 1939. What had begun as a morale operation for soldiers had become the architecture of globalization. Every element of that wartime experiment, portable production units, standardized formulas, centralized logistics, and local partnerships, had evolved into the corporate model of the post-war age. In a sense, Coca-Cola's secret mission had never ended. It had simply changed uniforms. When economic historians later reconstructed the company's wartime and post-war records, the pattern was unmistakable. The techniques used to deliver a single bottle to a soldier in Normandy or the South Pacific, the modular factory, the precise quality control, the integration with military transport, were the same principles that underpin the world's container shipping networks, air freight systems, and international franchising. The modern global supply chain was born in the same crucible that had produced the Allied victory. By the early 1960s, Coca-Cola's European network, first mapped under military supervision, had spread east and south, following the new trade routes of the Cold War world. Bases in Germany supplied Greece, Turkey, and the Middle East. Former U.S. Army logistics officers, now corporate planners, oversaw shipments to North Africa and South Asia. The company called it the global bottling system. To economists, it was the prototype of decentralized production, local ownership under global coordination. To diplomats, it was the invisible infrastructure of soft power. Government studied it. Harvard Business School taught it. And every historian who tried to explain how American culture had become planetary ended up tracing its arteries back to the same wartime promise Robert Woodruff had made in 1942, that every American in uniform should have a Coke within reach. That single line of patriotism had mobilized an entire logistics empire, and when the soldiers came home, the empire stayed. The post-war decades reinforced that momentum. The Korean War and the Vietnam War saw the same model repeated on a smaller scale. Coca-Cola followed U.S. forces wherever they went, establishing bottling plants that later became permanent businesses. By 1970, there were factories in Saigon, Manila, Bangkok, and Seoul. The company no longer needed the War Department's approval. It carried its own army of technicians and its own fleet of trucks. The wartime technical observers had become a professional class of global engineers. Cultural historians in the 1980s began to use a new term to describe this phenomenon, the Coke Front. It was shorthand for the intersection of commerce and ideology that defined American influence after 1945. The Soviet Union had its political satellites. The United States had its brands. Both projected systems of belief, but only one could be tasted. The bottle, critics said, had replaced the flag. and yet the flag had always been in the bottle. Archival research later revealed just how deliberate that connection had been. The U.S. War Department's files on morale operations included Coca-Cola alongside newsreels, musical broadcasts, and postal services. These were the instruments of normalcy, the everyday comforts that turned foreign battlefields into temporary extensions of home. When the war ended, Coca-Cola was the only one of those institutions that remained commercially viable. It had monetized familiarity. Every new market after 1945, from Japan to Nigeria, followed the same pattern. First military bases, then aid missions, then consumer demand. The company's supply chain was, in effect, a peacetime conversion of the U.S. military logistics system. By the time the Iron Curtain began to crumble in the late 1980s, Coca-Cola's return to Eastern Europe felt almost like the closing of a historical loop. The trucks that rolled into Warsaw, Prague, and Budapest in 1989 carried not only soft drinks, but the tangible proof of a half-century-old transformation. These were the same corridors of supply that had once fed the Western Front. To Eastern Europeans, the drink symbolized the West's victory without a shot fired. Within 2 years, the company opened plants in Russia itself, the final theater of its long, unofficial campaign. For historians looking back, the magnitude of that achievement lay not in marketing, but in structure. Coca-Cola had pioneered what military theorists would later call total logistics, a system capable of self-replication anywhere on Earth, independent of local instability. The blueprint was first drawn on army planning tables in 1942, refined on the beaches of North Africa, and perfected in the ruins of post-war Europe. Every cargo manifest, every syrup drum, every refrigeration unit was a node in a network designed for mobility. The world that emerged from that design was the modern economy itself, mobile, standardized, and infinitely reproducible. There was a paradox in that success. The same company that had defined the taste of victory also became a symbol of cultural homogenization. Intellectuals in France and Italy coined the term Coca-Colonization to describe the spread of American consumerism. Yet even those who criticized it drank it. The beverage had ceased to be merely a product. It was an element of identity. In the shattered economies of the post-war years, it represented stability. In the political divisions of the Cold War, it represented choice. And in the globalized markets of the late 20th century, it represented continuity. The wartime engineers who had started it all mostly faded into history. Their names appeared in company newsletters and occasional memoirs, but not in textbooks. Yet their contribution was foundational. They had learned to think globally because war had forced them to. Their challenge had not been marketing, but survival. How to deliver millions of glass bottles through battlefields without breaking the chain. In solving that problem, they created the operating logic of the global corporation. Today, when historians refer to Coca-Cola as the first multinational of the American century, they mean exactly that. It wasn't the first company to sell abroad. It was the first to function everywhere at once. It operated on the same principle as an army division: flexible command, identical equipment, local adaptation. And it did so decades before the word globalization entered common use. The world it built was one of constant supply, constant motion, and constant presence. That world began not in a boardroom, but in a war. By the 1990s, scholars revisiting wartime correspondence between the U.S. War Department and the Coca-Cola Company described the project as a civilian logistics miracle. In their view, the company's achievement lay not in selling sugar water, but in demonstrating how a private enterprise could synchronize with a military campaign without losing its identity. It had proven that commerce could move as fast as combat, and that culture could move faster than politics. The legacy is still visible. Every time disaster strikes and relief agencies deploy mobile purification units, they follow a model first tested by Coca-Cola's engineers in the North African desert. Every time a multinational corporation opens a plant in a newly stabilized country, it echoes the company's post-war return to Frankfurt or Vienna. The techniques of the 20th century's greatest war became the methods of its greatest peace. That, ultimately, is the meaning of the Coca-Cola mission. It was not secret because it was hidden. It was secret because its implications were not understood until decades later. A promise made to soldiers in 1942 became the template for the circulation of goods, images, and ideas that defined the post-war world. The bottle that followed the flag never stopped. It simply kept going, across borders, across ideologies, across generations, until it no longer needed the flag at all. When historians look back on the century, they often describe it as the American century. But in practical terms, it was the century of logistics, the triumph of movement over distance, of systems over scarcity. And at the center of that triumph stand a bottle born from war, carrying not just sugar and water, but the blueprint of globalization itself.